Common confusions on Sandel's 9th chapter, Dilemmas of Loyalty. Sandel begins the chapter by talking about three different sorts of obligations. The first would be natural obligations. These are moral duties that we have regardless of our situation or anything that we have or haven't agreed to. And these would be duties or obligations to, for example, not murder people. You don't have to agree or promise not to murder people to have an obligation not to do it, because it's obviously morally incorrect or unethical to murder folks. And so, therefore, you have a natural duty or a natural obligation not to go around murdering. The second sort of obligation is a contractual obligation. And these arise from making a voluntary agreement to do something or to not do something. So, for example, if we enter into an agreement, and I say that if you pay me $1,000, I'll tutor you on philosophy, and you give me $1,000, I now have an obligation to tutor you philosophy based on the contract and the agreement that we had reached. I have no natural obligation to tutor you in philosophy. It's not something that I'm just born into, but it is an obligation that I have based on the agreement that we struck and based on the fact that you satisfied your terms of the arrangement. The last sort of obligation or duty is the one that's the focus of the chapter, and Sandel actually wants to elaborate on for the purposes of defending his preferred approach to political philosophy, and those would be obligations of membership or solidarity. And these obligations of membership or solidarity, they arise from our position in the world, from our membership in a particular culture. And he gives examples of these non-chosen obligations that aren't natural, but at the same time they're not voluntary, through these really cool examples. And these cool examples and these cool stories are themselves the possible common confusion for the chapter, because there's so many cool stories that could just wind up being distracting. You might wonder, what's the point of all this stuff? So, for example, he uses the example of the French resistance fighter when Nazi Germany had overtaken various portions of France, and there were still people in the countryside in different pockets and different areas that resisted this, and they would actively do battle against the Frenchmen, their countrymen, who had sided with the Nazis. And this resistance fighter pilot, in most cases, would be willing to go and to bomb villages that supported the Nazis. However, when he's ordered to bomb his own village, he refuses, and he does this on grounds that he would not want to be the person who killed people that he knew, his neighbors, members of his actual small community and small miniature culture. And he does this because even though he resists the Nazi approach, even though he wants to defeat the Nazis, he has an assumed obligation. Got some kids playing in the treehouse out there. So, hi Justin, how are you? Sorry about the racket. It was not too much of a distraction, but he doesn't want to be the one to accidentally kill anybody from his village, because he feels like he has this obligation to him as a member of that village, or at least a former member of that village. Sandel also considers the example of Israel's evacuation of the Ethiopian Jews. And Israel comes in and they selectively save the Jews in Ethiopia that are in very dire straits, because they feel like they have some obligation to them as a Jewish state and the fact that they're fellow Jews. He considers the case of Robert E. Lee, the leader of the Confederate Army, who, even though he had professed a disinclination to support slavery and various objections to slavery, he couldn't bring himself to fight against his Virginian countrymen, because he was from Virginia. And so he said, even though I'm otherwise very loyal to the Union, and even though otherwise I reject slavery, I can't bring myself to fight against my countrymen in Virginia, because I'm just a Virginian myself and I have some obligation to them as a member of that culture. I've got a friend doing some concrete work out here as well. He's digging up the yard. I'll talk louder. So you got the Robert E. Lee example. So he's got this obligation he feels to Virginia, not because he necessarily agreed to defend Virginia. He had taken an oath actually to defend the Union and to be a loyal soldier in the Union Army and to support the United States generally. But he had this obligation back to Virginia itself and the citizens of Virginia, so much that he went back and led their army against the Union. And finally, Sandel also offers the example of the Bulger brothers. You've got Lee and Whitey, I'm sorry, not Lee, you've got Bill and Whitey Bulger, brothers in, I believe, Massachusetts, who took very different paths in life. And Whitey became the leader of a notoriously violent gang, and Bill became the president of the Massachusetts State Senate, the president of the University of Massachusetts. And so one was an upstanding member of the community, a leader in various ways, and the other was an infamous criminal. However, even though they'd taken these different paths, Bill argued that he had an obligation to remain somewhat loyal to his brother. And so when the FBI came to Bill to try to convince him to help them find his brother and bring him to justice, he refused on grounds that, hey, it's my brother. Even though I'm committed to the state of Massachusetts, even though I myself will never commit any of the terrible crimes that my brother has committed, even though I denounce the crimes that he has committed, I'm not going to help the government catch him. I feel like I have more of an obligation to him simply because I'm his brother. I noticed that Lee didn't do anything to choose to be born into the state of Virginia. The Bulger brothers didn't do anything to deserve or to choose to be born into their families, yet they still felt like they had these obligations to their state and to their family members that were obligations of what Sandel would call membership or solidarity. You might ask, why does Sandel emphasize this, and what's the point of all these different examples in this chapter? Well, he's using this as a contrast to the abstract, non-situational type approach to political philosophy of the liberal, libertarian, Kantian, Rawlsian vein. And he wants to argue that the teleological, Aristotelian, communitarian approach is more appropriate and superior to the abstract, perhaps objective approach of the other tradition. And he's doing that by showing that the social contract approach, where people at the very least have this tacit agreement to abide by society's laws and norms and to contribute to the economy so that they can pursue their conception of the good and reap the collective benefits, he wants to argue that you don't have to necessarily agree to arrangements, and you don't necessarily have to even buy into the social contract approach to have these obligations. This is consistent with McIntyre's narrative conception of the self. And McIntyre's narrative conception of the self argues that who we are, our identities, and our obligations are in large part a function of the situations we simply find ourselves in. We find ourselves a certain gender, we find ourselves of a certain race, we find ourselves born into particular cultures, in particular states, countries, religions, etc. And even though in most cases we don't reflect on and choose any of these things, and of course if we wanted to we couldn't choose our race for one, we still have some obligations that are born out of that narrative conception of identity. And so for McIntyre, if the young German were to argue, why in the world should I be taxed to pay compensation to the state of Israel? I was born in the year 2000, long after the Second World War. Why should I be saddled with the burden of the sins of my forefathers? McIntyre would say that as a German, you inherit some of the obligation of what your forefathers did. We're certainly not going to directly blame you for anything that the Nazi regime did to the Jews. We're not going to say that you're morally culpable, but that doesn't absolve you from all obligation to reconcile for the sins of your forefathers as a member of that culture and that state. So there you go, some common confusions on Sandel's 9th chapter with a little bit of distraction on the background. Hopefully that didn't take away too much from it. Hope this was helpful.